naturally. It has the mammalian hormones, but it also has a lot of compounds that mimic those hormones. So the fact that it was used in Chinese medicine for longevity speaks to this idea that as we age, those hormones naturally drop down and decline.
Welcome to the Wild Herbs Podcast, where we unpack and uncover the healing properties of wild herbs so you can heal naturally with the plants beneath your feet. I am your host, April Punsalan, wild, untamed plant lady, also a botanist, an ethnobotanist, and herbalist dedicated to teaching you how to heal with plants. If you want to learn edible and medicinal plants, you are in the right place, my friend. Welcome back to the Wild Herb Podcast, where we dive into the healing power of plants and we get to connect with the beautiful souls that bring us back to our ancestral ways. I'm deeply honored and excited for you to hear from Dr. Saeid Mushtagh. Dr. Saeid is a Canadian naturopathic doctor with a wealth of knowledge and experience bringing his patients back to holistic health. And he's also the co-founder of the Canadian Pine Pollen Company. And he has 20 years bringing people back to holistic health. And so he has so much to share with you today. And you are going to get many gold nuggets from this podcast interview. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm very honored that you're here.
So much for having me. It is an honor to be able to have a conversation, an elevated conversation with someone like-minded, for sure.
Well, I listened to some of your podcast interviews and got to read about your background, and I am thoroughly impressed with how well you truly understand the human body, and not just the body, the mind and the body. And I love how you say that the mind and the body are connected. You explained that on a podcast interview, and I love that you don't separate the two, because one health, right? So I've had the pleasure of listening to your past podcast interviews, and I learned that your functional medicine practice is what really led to the birthing of the Canadian Pine Pollen Company. So can you share with listeners how your practice, your healing practice, because you're a naturopathic doctor, led to the birthing of this amazing company that's based out of Canada?
Yeah, sure thing. It is actually a very interesting story because when I graduated back in 2006, there was a big push for taking naturopathic medicine into territories and provinces in Canada where there was no regulation. At a time, there was only Ontario and BC that were regulated. So one of the territories that didn't have any naturopathic doctor at all was the Northwest Territories. So I went into the Northwest Territories, put up my shingles, and as I was painting my office, like the rental office, I got my first patient knocking on my door saying that I want to see you today. And well, I can't really come back like tomorrow. Anyhow, so I started feeling a really busy practice within a short little time because everybody didn't have access. So I was the first one showing up there. So one of my earlier patients, who's my business partner now, Burgess, years later came to my office and said he was always curious about natural health products. Like he was one of the early adapters. He was already taking some supplements up there. He was trying to treat himself nutritionally. So he would come to the appointments once in a while and he would throw ideas at me. What do you think of spirulina? Is that a good thing? What do you think of this? So as years went by, one day he came in and said, Saeid, what do you think of pine pollen? I said, what? I didn't know anything about it. I'd never heard about it. It was such a new thing. So I started reading and found out that it is traditionally been used in Chinese medicine, essentially for promoting qi and longevity and resolving dampness. Now, those are really interesting things because dampness is one of those things that sets in as we age, right? Like that's the inflammation, the sagging that happens. So it was intriguing, but also the fact that the microbiome, like the biology of it or the chemistry of it had shown that it has testosterone. That was mind-blowing because we only have a few plants in the botanical world that do have testosterone. Nowadays, they're finding that there is any kind of sprouting tissue, any tissue that's germinating has some levels of testosterone or brassinosteroids that mimic like testosterone. So that was really intriguing. And so Burgess and I, we hooked up with a couple of his friends that were they had done tree planting, and they were connected with a company that did tree planting to figure out, okay, well, if pine pollen comes from, most of the pine pollen that was in the market is coming from China, why is there nobody locally harvesting that? And what are the barriers to that? So after working with the imported pollen and learning some of the just nuances of what that pollen goes through before it lands in the North American market, I decided, well, let's go out and get our own, at least for ourselves. It was more of an excuse to get on motherland, just get out on Mother Nature and set up camping and whatnot. But over the years, it turned into this business that we have now where we hire individuals to go out. We have mapped out the locations. We know which trees within the age groups, what latitudes, what altitudes, all of that. And so that's how it spun out. It was one of my patients. And Burgess, my business partner, he was, in a small community of Yellowknife where I had my practice, 20,000 individuals, actually get to know everyone. So it was also my friend because we would, there were nights we would gather. There was 5 or 6 of us playing Catan. And so he was a friend and a patient, and I trusted his personality and character to actually go into business with him. So that's how the business was founded in 17, actually. 16 was where we did a pilot project going into the bush and trying to get as much pollen for ourselves and playing around with the different pine species that are available in Canada, and then understanding the dynamics of what does it cost to actually get it out of the land? What does it take to produce it? The biggest barrier in pine pollen production is, in terms of scaling it, is preserving it. So easy to make, and in fact, we encourage everyone who has got a pine tree nearby to go and harvest it every year, because I think the more we understand the value, the food, nutritional, medicinal value of herbs, the more we tend to be preserving them. We tend to be more of a stewards towards their preservation. One of the pines that we harvest here, Ponderosa, is... Ponderosa, yeah. It's not endangered, but it is, in a way, only growing in Canada on reservations and preserved. Most ranchers cut them down to avoid hiding places for cougars or cut them down for their wood benefit. But if they knew that ponderosa tree on their yard is actually more like a fruit tree, giving them so much of the benefits of the pollen, they would, and every year they would be harvesting it, they would have more value for it, they would have more appreciation for it, they would be more likely to preserve it.
Definitely. How many different pine species are you harvesting now for the Canadian Pine Pollen Company?
We are focused on 2 species that are not considered endangered in Canada and have First Nation historical records of their So the safety issue with Health Canada is big in terms of, there's 126 different species across the world, and most of them are in the Northern Hemisphere. Most of them are very genetically similar to each other. But 3 pines in North America have historical indigenous use: Pinus virginicus, Pinus ponderosa, and Pinus contorta. And in Canada, we have contorta and ponderosa, which we harvest from.
Very interesting. And are you able to test the amount of enzymes they have or their phytochemical content to see if there's variation in the pine pollen?
I was just in Palm Springs this past weekend on a conference called AAMP, American Association of Naturopathic Doctors, presenting a poster on the research we have done on the chemical composition of these 2 pines, comparing them to a European pine that has historical use, Pinus sylvestris, and the 2 Chinese pines that are most commercially available, Pinus smithsoniana and Pinus tubuliformis. So the research paper was looking at the pollen of Ponderosa, contorta, sylvestris, and the Chinese pines, and looking at the comparability of their phytochemicals. And what is in pollen, for the most part, is protein, carbs. All pollen have that because that's just the nature of pollen. And then a small amount of oils, where these brassinosteroids or steroidal compounds fall under, and antioxidants. So our paper was essentially looking at existing published data on the macronutrients, the proteins and the amino acids and the different carbohydrates. But we had partnered up with a lab out of the Czech Republic to look at the testosterone, specifically the brassinosteroids, the progesterone, and the estrogen. So like the mammalian hormones and their analogs. What we found out was Ponderosa has the highest brassinosteroid, and then all the other ones trail similarly next to it. So it has more testosterone. But the conclusion was not so much this species versus that species. The conclusion was freshness. Because, yeah, we looked at the age. So, like, we looked at Ponderosa after a year. After a year. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that with Sylvestris or the imported pines because they're commercially available, right? So we looked at commercially available pollen and what it is. And as they age, these brassinosteroids start disintegrating. So their levels drop down. So what's more important than which species is how fresh is the pollen.
That makes sense. So this pollen that I have in this jar right here, which hopefully we get to collection towards the end, because you see, I could probably evolve a little bit, but this was collected in the end of March, April, because spring comes really early in Charleston.
Right.
It hasn't been a year. It's only been a couple of months. So do you think it still has those, would you call them brassinoids? I know those are the things that we want, which we'll get into. Do you think it still has?
Oh, yeah, it still has.
Okay. Okay. So maybe
it starts degrading, but it still happens, right? Now,
okay.
What happens is that the degradation over time dwarfs the species variation. Like it degrades so
right. I can see that.
The species variation is not really an issue.
Okay. And so I guess for
home use, you're better off after collecting it to freeze it that way.
Okay.
There is actually a lot of research going back in the 70s in the forestry field, trying to cross hybridize different pines. And so there is actual research where they would harvest the pollen and they would look at its viability over time, because then they would use that pollen to germinate other species. Right? So the viability, the pollen can stay viable for 5 years if it's freezer packed in the freezer.
Wow, that is so good to know. Yeah, it's really important to freeze. I mean, that's how I like my fish when I buy salmon frozen. So for those, because for some of us, we know about pine pollen, right? Especially you are the expert. I am a complete novice, but I've done a little bit of research. But for the listeners that don't know about pine pollen, can you tell them what is pine pollen, why it's a superfood, and why it really helps improve your longevity?
Yeah, for sure. So pine pollen, this is pine pollen.
Oh, nice. Can you bring that?
Oh my God, that's pine. Oh my God.
Oh my gosh, I wish you could bring that over here.
Oh man. Yeah, so that's pine pollen. It's this very fine yellow powder that is the male germ cell of the pine tree. So in order to propagate, the pine trees make two types of cones, the male cone and the female cone. The male cone is these guys that grow in the springtime at the tip of the trees. They're usually on the tree for about a good 3 weeks at the most, from the time they show up to the time they pollinate and fall down. The female cones are the woody cones that everybody knows about and the pine nuts come from. So the pollen needs to sit on, just goes up in the air, floating in, lands on the female cone and germinates the cell. So essentially it's the fruit, I call it the fruit of the pine trees, but it's in the tips. And what is beneficial about it is it supports hormones naturally. It has the mammalian hormones, but it also has a lot of compounds that mimic those hormones. So the fact that it was used in Chinese medicine for longevity speaks to this idea that as we age, those hormones naturally drop down and decline. We can get into a research of it too. There's trials where they show it helps the HPA axis regulation, hypothalamic pituitary regulation. It can trigger some detoxification in the liver because of those brassinosteroids. So it's a wonderful food because traditionally it was used as a commodity, as a food. The Koreans use it in baking. The Chinese use it in change of season soup when it was available. It does make its way to a lot of Chinese formulas that are focused on anti-aging and longevity. But like I said, the biggest problem was preserving it. And that's why, like in a small scale production, once you do it for yourself, as soon as you get it, you do want to push it into a freezer and then bring it out. What the Chinese had figured out in the 70s was it can be preserved by microwave sterilization, which is what they do. So,
Whoa, that sounds very scientific. Sounds like something I'm not doing at home.
oh no, that sounds like something we should be avoiding entirely because it's at the end it's microwave, right? So
Yeah.
fast microwaves at it until nothing grows on it, right? Like you heat it up to such an extent, and a lot of the herbs that actually come that are imported are sterilized that way.
I didn't know that. I will have to do my own research on that because I didn't know that. I teach a lot of times and compare something I harvested compared to something that was bought, and it's always usually night and day. I mean, unless you're dealing with a local farmer and you have a close connection with them and they're sending it to you, or it's an amazing company like your company or Yopon, Yopon Brothers, where it's that the product is sustainably harvested and shipped, and a lot of time and effort goes into that. How old do pine trees have to be to produce the pollen?
So depends on the species. Ponderosa has to be at least 15 to 20 years. Lodgepole goes into pollination a lot faster. It can be 5 or 6 years.
Okay. Because I saw when you were harvesting too, I noticed because I watched the videos, which I recommend you listening, go to the Canadian Pine Pollen, and they have wonderful videos of the beautiful people that work for the company or with the company harvesting it. And the one thing I noticed, which made me happy, is that you collect the whole pine pollen cone and then you're laying it out on screens and then the pine pollen is dropping, I suspect. And so I had watched, when I first wanted to harvest pine pollen, I watched all these YouTube videos and some people will put like bags over the cones and then they shake them. And I just felt like I just wanted to harvest the whole cone and then bring it back and let the pine pollen fall out. And so when I saw that that's kind of how you do it, but on a way larger scale, I was like, okay, I'm not too far off from how I'm supposed to be doing this. But do you have any advice for people that just want to harvest pine pollen out, in the national forest?
Yeah, I think you got to be a botanist or you got to have spend time with the plants in order to have that intuition to kick in. Because when we first started the company between the four of us, we said, let's go out and see how much pollen we can get. And I went and picked the buds. And the other guys went in and just shook the pollen off into bags. But yeah, so the most straightforward way of harvesting would be to show up. The buds go through 4 stages, making the pollen. And the fourth stage is when the pollen is released. The first stage is where there's no pollen in the buds. It's just the bud growing. The second stage was where the pollen starts developing. The third stage, pollen develops fully. The fourth stage is released. So you want to show up there during the third stage, roughly. And it's really tough to time it like that because some of the buds are going to be, sometimes you find an entire bud and you have like 3 different stages on it. Some are pollinating, some are still growing, some are still like making the pollen. But essentially if you squeeze it, there's not water or fluid coming in. It's semi-dry, but it's not fully dry and it's not opened up to release the pollen. So you show up at that time and you collect the buds. For the ponderosa, we tend to just collect the buds and leave the tip on the tree. For the lodgepole, it's impossible because they're so much smaller and you just got to collect it. And then once you've done that, you lay it out in an area where there's no wind because as they dry, it's going to get blown away. And usually if the temperatures are right and you've laid them thin enough for them not to grow fungus because they have a tendency to grow fungus really quickly. So you have to lay them thinly. And then once it's dry, you just essentially shake it and you get the pollen. In obviously larger scale, it becomes difficult to do that. So we've got equipments and we got machinery to do that work for us. And because we go through about, what is it? So last year we got about 2 tons of buds. So that's a lot of buds. That's like trailer loads of buds. So it just becomes, from a scale standpoint, handshaking it is impossible. So, and then once you've shaken it, you collect it in a jar. It goes straight into, you can sieve it after. You can sieve it with like a cheesecloth, just a strainer. You put it in a mason jar and put it in your fridge and you bring it out.
Mm.
About a teaspoon is roughly the dose. Those I've made cakes with it, like making it with almond flour and just making like big
Mm.
cakes. And from the smell, once you bake it, is just out of this world. It's got a very particular scent to it, but it's very neutral if you mix it with water, tea. I love it in my tea. So my morning routine is a teaspoon of pollen, a pinch of saffron, and I
Mm.
green tea. I've been doing that for many years now.
I love that routine. One thing that you said is you understand the human body so well, and you're a phenomenal teacher. So I want to bring this topic up about sleep because you said that the pine pollen, the one thing when you first started using it, you noticed that it improved the regenerative quality of your sleep. And you talked about how it regulated your cortisol levels, or you think that it regulates cortisol levels, or it does. And so I would love to hear about how pine pollen in general balances our hormones, helps decrease cortisol levels, which then can lead to better sleep. Because I believe a lot of women and men are struggling with high cortisol levels, hormonal imbalance, and sleep issues. And so I think that is a really important a really important topic for you to discuss on this podcast.
Absolutely. Like high cortisol is, I would say it's a cultural disease of the 20th century. That's what everybody is experiencing because our lives are set up in a way that we would be releasing cortisol on an ongoing basis. Like most people work 8-hour days. By the time they finish their job, they get home, they gotta frantically make something prepared for eating and then frantically make something else prepared for the next morning and then eat it on behind the wheel to get to their work on time. And then same thing to spend like another half an hour on traffic. If you're lucky, I have patients that are like 2 hours driving back and forth, right? Okay. So all of that is, if you think about just the simple act of driving, that is a very high cortisol action, right? It's your nervous system is on high alert. Anything could go wrong right now. If you're not paying it, if you're not fully attentive to everything that's going around you, that's a very heightened state. We're not in traditional like small city life or small village life. You didn't have this type of stressors. And if you did, you would have periods of it. And then the harvest season would be over and there would be like a good 2, 3, maybe even 4 months of just more relaxed lifestyle compared to those heightened states. So everybody is experiencing high cortisol. The other thing that is coffee is the biggest driver of the economy, right? That's what coffee is driving the North American economy. We have been stuck in post World War II economy of 8 hours, high productivity, go, go, go. And that's really taxing everyone. That's why by the time people get to their early 40s, late 30s, everybody feels some kind of an adrenal fatigue where the adrenal gland that are producing cortisol are not able to meet their daily rhythm anymore. So what do we do in a scenario like that, right? A lot of what I do with patients in terms of trying to figure out their lifestyle around the idea of what are the natural things you can do to reduce these cortisol levels. And there are things that come in the bottle, but there are things that don't come in the bottle that are foundational, right? In naturopathic medicine, we look at the causation of disease, and the causation here being a heightened awareness state, not awareness, a heightened chaotic awareness state. So one of the things I get to patients to do is, I get them to do nice rhythmic breathing exercises on a daily basis. I get them to cut their coffee to maximum 3 to 4 cups a week. I find that those are the basics. I could get them to cut their sugars. I get them to start their day with water. So these are all the things that can help create some balance. But when it comes to herbs to help that balance activity, pine pollen is one of my go-tos, especially if they're in the late 30s where the hormonal system is going to naturally decline. When you think about cortisol regulation, the brain regulates the pituitary, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and the adrenals, which are the source of cortisol, then go on to improve conversion of thyroid. They go on to improve or trigger the different changes that happens between estrogen progesterone balance, secondary to the thyroid activation. So the adrenals are your key organs of overall regulation. And cortisol has got this biphasic pattern of secretion, and it has two different main functions in the body. One of them is to regulate inflammation. Another one is to bring up blood sugar. So unfortunately, most of the functionality of cortisol in a modern life goes towards sugar regulation because of the stress, gets the nervous system going. It pulls on the sugar in the circulation, so that you get a dip in blood sugar, which needs to be compensated by release of stored sugar or glycogen from your liver, which cortisol triggers that. So this daily pattern of like relying on your adrenal gland over and over and over and over time gets the patient to a place, or a person to a place, where they find that, they wake up, but they're not fully rested. Then early afternoon comes in, they need a stimulant or a tea or a coffee or sugar to actually be able to push through that early afternoon. And if they go and exercise, they find that they don't have the ability to recover, and their body's achy and whatnot, because they've been shunting that cortisol towards sugar regulation, that they can't really deal with the inflammatory aspects of post-exercise and recovery anymore. So one of my two goes, and I have a lot of herbs for adrenal fatigue that I love, but one of the two goes is pine pollen. And what I noticed for myself, I'm one of those individuals that needs a good 9 hours sleep. I think I'm cognitive, and because of that thinking, I do need to actually get a good night's sleep. What pollen did for me was, and I was taking a lot of herbs before that. I was taking ginseng, I was taking astragalus, I'm taking this combination herb formula called ginseng endurance formula, which is adaptogenic herbs. And I've been taking that since I hit my 30s, based on my understanding of what my body needs. But what pine pollen did when I started it, which was very surprising, because most males take it for getting like better libido and erection and this and that. But I took it because of the HPA axis regulation. And what I found for myself was I could get away with 8.5 hours of sleep, which you may think it's not a whole lot, but it's an extra half an hour of awake living, right? So that was for me really good. That was my personal notice, what I noticed with it. But we've had over the years patients, I've had patients that have noticed the same thing. We've had clients online that have responded with the same thing. The animal models, there's no human models to study HPA axis, because if you're studying it and you want to know how much your adrenal gland changes in size, unless you're doing functional MRIs, you won't be able to know it. But in animal studies, what they see is that the pine pollen supplementations improves HPA axis by increasing the size of the adrenal gland, which, it's one of those things, like it's one of those glands that can change size from like a walnut size to a pea size, depending on how much exhausted it is.
Oh my gosh, I did not know that.
Yeah.
That is wild that it changes size from a pea to what did you say, a walnut?
Walnut. When it's like healthy and just, it's actually producing the amount of cortisol you need, it's much bigger, but as you age, it starts shrinking.
Because I wanted to ask you how, because the scientist in me always wants to know how, because if we understand how, then we can educate people better, So the pine pollen can increase the size of the adrenal gland. You mentioned that it's a live cell.
Regulation of the adrenal gland. We don't know if it increases the size in animals. It's what we know in humans is clinical trials are showing that it improves anabolic health. So anabolic health is the component of your health. Anabolism is like creating new tissue, right? At any given point, there is anabolic activity and catabolic activity. So you're making tissue or you're breaking down tissue. So anabolic health, if you're not having proper anabolic health, cholesterol starts coming up, inflammation starts building up, blood pressure can rise, symptoms of arthritis, joint pain starts coming in. So a lot of things that are, in a way, if you think about it, a lot of things that are associated and can be circumvented with proper exercise and movement. Because exercise gives you anabolic health. It helps regulate your hormones. It improves circulation. It improves the detoxification pathways because of improving circulation. So a lot of the basic things of inflammation regulation is under anabolic health. So most patients that have high cholesterol, it's likely because they have low hormones. They have lower testosterone level. They don't have a good balance of estrogen, progesterone. And that's why cholesterol is coming in, because the body is saying, oh, we don't have enough hormones. Let's upregulate the molecule that's going to become those hormones. So let's upregulate cholesterol so that cholesterol can then go and become your testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So in human trials, all across the world, anabolic health improves. And from a mechanistic understanding of it is essentially comes down to the antioxidants that are in pollen that gives it that yellow color. But a lot of plants have that. Most importantly, it comes down to the steroids that are in pollen. That the pollen itself uses it as a growth for its growth. So those steroids can help with the germination of the pollen. It's really cool when you look at under the microscope at a germinated pollen. You've heard of the doctrine of signatures, right?
Yes. And now, after studying herbalism for 28 years, I'm not going to lie. In the beginning, I was like, doctrine of signatures. I don't know how old I was. Maybe I was 23. I was like, I don't know. I kind of believe it, but I kind of don't. I don't know if it was a scientist in me. But now I'm like, this is real. This doctrine of signatures, we can use this. And now I'm just fascinated by it. Like the other day I was pulling down on the willow branch and I was teaching. I was like, it's so flexible. Hello, it's so good for the joints. And so now I'm starting to really connect with the plants and look at them and think about that. So yeah, the doctrine of signatures. Yeah.
When it works, it works. When it doesn't work, it doesn't. It's one of those things that it's, but another question actually that it's even in like from an intuitive standpoint, like even the linguistics behind the pine, like the pinus, right? It's like this erect species. The language even translates to like some of the impacts it has. But that aside, the doctrine of signature with the pollen is really interesting because it looks like the male organ after it germinates. And yeah.
You said the pine pollen germinates. What do you mean by that? Are you mean when it fertilizes the ovule?
Yeah, it needs to germinate to fertilize the ovule.
It needs to so does it germinate before it fertilizes the ovule?
No, it lands on the male cone. So I'm just going to turn it around.
Okay.
See that?
Whoa, that is crazy.
Yeah.
Wow. So it looks just like the male organ.
Yeah, the pollen itself looks like a mouse's head. And the two ears are the air sacs that allow for the pollen to be able to flow in the air. And then when it germinates, it creates that germination tube. And they're trying to figure out what that signal is that triggers the germination. It's not fully understood if it is within the pollen itself or it is from the ovule of the cone that is coming in. But once it sits, actually, another cool thing about it is this. It takes 2 years for this process to happen. So the pollen lands on the cone and it goes dormant. It gets sucked into the cone openings and it goes dormant. The following year, there is a signal, which they don't know what it is yet, that triggers the germination. And the germination tube forces itself into the ovule to release the genetic material in there. Now, once that happens, the ovule that goes dormant as well. So it starts splitting, makes like a few splits, and then it goes dormant. And in the second year, that's where you get the pine seed happening, pine nut happening. So it's a 2-year process for it to happen, which is super cool.
It is. That is phenomenal. That's interesting. It's long. They're before the flowering plants evolved the ovule within the parent of the plant. So they're the naked seeds. So I guess that's why it just takes longer. There's probably a protective part of it. I always have to teach the life cycle of pines. And when I do, I always have to reteach myself because it's kind of complicated.
Mm-hmm. They have figured out how to germinate it artificially. And it's just about like a little bit of sugar in water and you just put the pollen in there and it germinates at 27 degrees. We've tried that in the facility here just to see and play around with the idea of making a germinated pine pollen extract because the germination also changes the profile of the steroids in favor of the testosterone. But doing it at scale is something we haven't figured out yet.
So you talk about how the pine pollen is a live cell or living cell rather, and that it's high in enzymes. And I've read a lot of what I read about pine pollen. It really talks about the amino acids and the enzymes. Can you touch on how the enzymes help our body? Like how do the enzymes in pine pollen help contribute to our longevity or our health overall?
Absolutely. So the enzymes, when you think about the hierarchy of the word, the enzyme, an enzyme is a protein molecule that's going to be able to trigger some kind of a change or activity within the tissue, right? So the enzymes of the pine pollen fall under four different categories. One is the brassinosteroids, which are growth promoting. Another one is the cytokinins, which they have anti-aging activities or age-related outcomes in human tissues. But for plants, cytokinins are also growth promoting. And then abscisic acid is another group of enzymes that's a single molecule, but it does have enzymatic activity. For the most part, it comes down to the brassinosteroids. The brassinosteroids are like golden enzymes of the pine pollen. And the word brassino goes back to the fact that it was initially discovered in germinating canola seeds, so rape seeds. And so brassino is from that family, Brassinaceae family of plants. And then the steroids are steroids. It's in humans, the steroids are anabolic enzymes. Well, they're not anabolic enzymes. They're not enzymes, but they are anabolic activity. So the brassinosteroids act in plants like growth hormones. But what we know in humans, and they act in plants like growth hormones because they have an impact on the nitric oxide production. So they trigger nitric oxide signaling. We know in humans, nitric oxide improves circulation. It improves a lot of things associated with sexual function is nitric oxide dependent. So most of their human analog impacts are through these brassinosteroids.
Very fascinating. Thank you. You said that pine pollen increases our anabolic levels, our state, right? It improves our health. And you talk about how when you have low oxygen levels, tend to have more inflammation, right? And when the blood sugar is high, it decreases our oxygen levels. And then that leads to the inflammation, which I found really fascinating. Can you touch on how pine pollen can improve our oxygen levels? I mean, is that the same of what you were talking about, how it improves the anabolic state?
Yeah, it really does that. Like the anabolic health that comes secondary to the impact of pine pollen comes from this idea of increasing. So just let's take a step back and look at how anabolic hormones work in the human body, whether it's testosterone, whether it's progesterone. They have health growth promoting activity. And growth requires more respiration. It requires more oxygen, which then requires more oxygen delivery, which then relies on nitric oxide to cause a vasodilation to bring that oxygen in. That oxygen then triggers more mitochondrial respiration, more cellular respiration, and which the analogy I like to use is if we got our lungs to draw oxygen from the air, we have our mitochondria inside the cell to draw oxygen from our blood to be able to produce energy. So the bottom line of anabolic health is increased oxygen delivery, increased cellular respiration, increased energy production, and increased cellular repair and tissue protection, which is with all of those things that are like decline with aging. So if you're 20s and you take a fall, you're going to bounce back from that really quickly because your anabolic health is like really high. Your ability to build new tissue is really high. But in your 30s and 40s, the recovery is going to be much longer. One of the things I see in practice, which I deal with day in, day out, is with concussion patients. So and one of the things that happens in head injuries, especially in older individuals, is the knock they get in their head sometimes impacts the HPA, hypothalamic pituitary axis. And in doing that, their hormone levels just drop down a little bit. There was this really cool study where they gave progesterone to men and women post-concussion, and they looked at the recovery, and their recovery generally is improved by increased, like just the prescription of progesterone. Because 30s and 40s, whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to have lower progesterone levels. And progesterone, we know of it in the context of the female body more so, but in men, one of the things that progesterone does is that it helps reduce the degradation of testosterone to the DHT format of it. So it keeps your testosterone active. So in a way, in a concussion scenario, which is one of the biggest examples of this reduction in anabolic health, reduction in oxygenation, reduction in mitochondrial function, when you increase anabolic health, you increase recovery. And pine pollen is the same thing. Pine pollen is the plant, Mother Nature's hacked source of progesterone, testosterone, and DHEA, which that is the fascinating thing about it. If you think about tribulus, for example, it's going to give you some testosterone. If you think about tonkat alley, another herb, it'll give you testosterone. If you think about maca, it will give you that. But there isn't anything that has all of them in the same, like progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, estradiol, all of it in one single plant source. Pollens as a whole have that. Pine pollen, by the nature of being a really big size, grain size, has the most of it. So let's say bee pollen, you're getting some of these anabolic health. So like everybody knows about bee pollen. It's been around for the longest time. And it delivers these exact same things. It is high in protein. It's high in carbs. It does have steroids in it, except the contrast being by the virtue of their size, the size of the trees, compared to like the daisies or flowering herbs, the pollen grain is so much bigger. And that's why there's lesser allergy reactions to pine pollen versus grasses and other flowering species that produce pollen as well.
Thank you for saying that, because when you were talking, I was thinking about that. Well, what about the pollen, on other stamens? Because my daughter, I will never forget, we lived on this land or before we built the house, and she was just eating camellia stamens, like the anthers, and she was just eating them. And I was like, being a botanist, I'm like, well, it's not poisonous. I don't know why she's really eating these, and I just let her eat it. But thinking about it, like probably all pollen is a superfood, but pine pollen is just, like you're saying, is a bigger molecule, and we can harvest it and we can freeze it, where if you're doing that with another species, it's going to take you a long time.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Even within the Pinaceae, certain pine trees, it's tough to harvest because their buds are so much smaller, and the staging that I was talking about, when you harvest them, you have things that are like in stage 4 already, and then buds that are not even past the stage 1. So all Pinaceae can be hand harvested. Spruce family of trees can also be hand harvested. The pollen from spruce can be harvested as well.
That's really cool.
But so much less in terms of yield and whatnot.
Obviously, we could talk for a long time, and I feel like I would love to do another podcast with you more on the naturopathic side, but I wanted to ask you 2 important questions that I've thought about, and you can Google, you can chat GPT them, but I would love to hear from you. And that is that pine pollen is better absorbed in fat and oil because of the hormones. And so can you talk about that the best way to get it into your body, whether alcohol or fat? Because I also heard alcohol is really good for the men because it helps you absorb the testosterone or the androgens. But fat, I'm wondering if fat would be a good way for women to get it into their body. I don't know. I'm just wondering about mode of administration or solvent for the pine pollen.
Absolutely. So alcohol is, in botanical medicine, has been one of the best solvents that has been used because it is a solvent, but also preservative. Historically, most plant extracts, if you wanted to preserve them, you had only 2 options before all these chemical preservatives that we have synthesized. You either had alcohol or later on, much like 100 years later on, you had glycerin. So those were the only 2 kind of alcohols, natural alcohols that you had that were accessible. Now, any substance that is a fat, so whether it's a sterol, whether it's a brassinosteroid, whether it's a steroid, whether it's omega-3s, whether it's vitamin D, anything that's a fat is going to absorb better if it is in a polar solvent or it's in a fat-based solution. And that's where this whole idea of what's the best absorbable or absorption method for pine pollen extract, alcohol would be the best one because alcohol is a very small molecule. Anything that's dissolved in alcohol, if you're holding it under your tongue, it can get absorbed through the veins under the tongue. So that's one of the ways that it allows for absorption. In terms of fat sources, that definitely is a good use, like especially if you're like baking the pollen or the fat that goes in there, or if you're putting it in some hot water and adding a little bit of coconut oil and whatnot to it. Traditional Chinese medicine, they essentially have done decoctions with it. And most traditional Chinese medicine sources are like that, where they take the herb and they boil it up and then they condense it down and they use that as a source. So traditional use has been decoction, not even tinctures, and still has that impact. So it really comes down to dosage. If it is an alcoholic source, you can get more medicinal benefit with a lower dosage because the absorption is higher. Not in the alcohol and you're using the pollen, for example, straight up in cooking or in food and whatnot, you obviously need a higher dosage because a lot of those good nutrients, by the time they get to your gut, there's this thing called the first pass effect where everything that you digest gets filtered to your liver. The liver needs to know if this is toxic, if this is good, what do I do with it? And through that first pass effect, the liver essentially is going to take up all the good things for itself as opposed to giving it to the rest of the tissue. Whereas when you take an alcoholic extract under the tongue, it's available to circulation. So it's available to all the tissues. So you're bypassing that first pass effect. But here's the thing. There is one thing you don't get out of the alcoholic extract that you get from the pollen itself, and that's the microbiome impact. So true enough, if you take the pollen as a standalone, you're only absorbing about 30 to 40% of that's steroids, and the rest of it doesn't come to your system. But it is a substrate for the good bugs in your gut. There's this one animal research with chickens where they fed them pine pollen, and it actually increases the microbiome in a way that the omega-3 content of the eggs increases. So that's a super cool thing.
That's really cool. Yeah, that shows you diversity is really important. Yeah, so maybe trying it multiple ways. I put it in honey with ginseng powder, pine pollen, and sumac berries crushed. And that was kind of my energy tonic, if you will, in the spring. And it worked really well. I got lucky. I was at a farmer's market and a crew was cutting down the pine tree. And I should have collected way more, but I was, I had something else to do afterwards. And I'm like, they're trying to get produce and I'm like putting the pine pollen in my basket, the pine cones. But looking back, I'm like, I should have just sat there and got all that pine because it was loaded. But that is something that you could do listening is maybe talk with the local tree cutter and be like, hey, around the spring, if you cut down a pine, let me know, and then get the pine pollen that way. Because sometimes it's too high to even get.
Yeah, that's where we found. So like the first 2-3 years of making this company, we spent a lot of time on the road trying to like locate plantations that, you show up and they've trimmed the lower branches for fire purposes. So like you don't have access. Then you show up and so we have made a conscious decision only to harvest from trees where we can reach by hand. And that's more of a wild harvest ethical protocol that we have developed for ourselves, internal protocol, because generally when it comes to wild harvest, you're not meant to harvest more than 15 to 30% of what you come across.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you're doing that to a wild patch of nettles. You show up there and you harvest 30%. The next person shows up there and harvests 30%. The next person shows up 30%. Then you've reduced that to like what is left is 10, 15% behind. Whereas with pine pollen, the beauty of it is you show up and you harvest the lower branches. The next person shows up there, they can't really harvest from that same tree. So, and the lower branches usually like in older trees is just as little as 5, maybe 7% of what the tree produces. So the bulk of it is left in there. But I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, honey.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really awesome. Again, like intuitive, right? So the First Nations in northern Russia and the Chinese, before there was this microwave ability to sterilize pollen, they used honey as a preservative. So they mixed it up, pollen with honey, and that's how they consumed it. That's how they allowed for it to be shelf stable and consume it over time.
It's so good. I mean, and it looks so beautiful when you mix it because the golden honey with the yellow pollen, it's amazing. So, do you have any pollen? Because I went to your website and I saw tinctures, but I didn't see any pollens. Can you still buy pollen from you, from
Yeah,
Canadian Pine
yeah.
Pollen? Nice.
Buy pollen. I'll hook you up with both species so that you can see the difference. You can still buy pollen from us. One of the species, Ponderosa, we always tend to run out.
Mm.
It's more of a rarity, but the lodgepole is more accessible. Lodgepole or Pinus contorta. It's mostly grows in Canada. It's used for the lumber industry, so there's a lot of plantations. So there's a lot of it here. Whereas Ponderosa is limited to the contracts we had with ranchers or First Nations. So there's very limited access we get every year. And Ponderosa goes through this cyclical phase of every 3 or 4 years, it doesn't produce pollen. And the trees, like even some trees, have a little bit of a different cycle than the trees around them. So some trees, like that 3-year cycle is off for some trees and on for other ones. So we tend to always run out of it and have a short supply, and we're always like, oh, can we get more Ponderosa? Can we get more Ponderosa?
It's special. Yeah, that's amazing that you get to work with the First Nations and the indigenous people and help support them. And then that's a beautiful thing.
That's what our policy when we work with them is knowledge sharing. So when we work with them, one of the things we do is we always teach them how to harvest it at a small scale for themselves, because the oral tradition shows that they were using it. But that knowledge has been generationally lost. They don't know it anymore. You ask them about it, they're not even aware that the pollens, most of them, that are actually producing this, which shows that like separation from the contact with the land. Because if you're on the land throughout the seasons, there's no way you can miss the trees blooming.
Right.
Generational gap, that oral tradition hasn't really passed its generations.
Well, it's good that you're helping keep that alive. So, for those of you listening, I'll put a link in the show notes, and there'll also be a coupon code that you can use to get a discount on products from Canadian Pine Pollen Company. Is the pine pollen available now? What do you have on your website available now, or usually throughout the year? And can you tell us when Ponderosa pine pollen is available? Does that ever go on the website?
It is. So essentially, once we have harvested and produced it, we put everything in a freezer and release batches out of the freezer. So we have, and every year's harvest, by the time we process and we are ready to release, it becomes either December or January of the following year. So the Ponderosa we harvested this year is going to be released in December or January. So up until then, we still have Ponderosa, but we don't have the 1 kg bulk. We have sold out of those. We are selling out of the 70 gram, I think, in the next couple of months based on the trends. But we still have the smaller bottles of Ponderosa, the 30 grams. We have one of the things we have made, and we made this with professionals in mind, with other naturopathic doctors, because we were getting this question left, right, center. Do I order Ponderosa? Do I order Lodgepole? What's the difference between the two, right? And that's where we went and did that study on the micronutrients to see what's the variability. And that's where we found out the variability is really dependent on the shelf life, which kind of confirmed our understanding of and our process of why we harvest it, we process it, we put it in the freezer and release it after, because freshness is the most important thing. So the two species, not a whole lot of difference. Whether you get Lodgepole, whether you get Ponderosa, you're going to get the same anabolic impact. The Ponderosa is my favorite tree because of the two of them, because it's just this magnificent, gorgeous, beautiful, huge tree, right? It's a huggable tree. Whereas Contorta is not so much. It's tiny, scrawny. It's been selected for like shooting straight up for its lumbar purpose. So we have them both available online. When you go in, you can get different sizes. If you wanted to order bulk, 1 kg, we only have lodgepole available. We don't have Ponderosa. And if you get the gold labels, you actually get a balanced 50-50% Ponderosa and lodgepole in there.
Oh, cool. I like that. I'm definitely going to order some because I love it. And I could see a difference when I was using the honey. I could feel a shift in my energy. So I feel like I'm really sensitive. I don't do coffee. I don't do caffeine barely ever. And so I could feel that shift. Yeah, that lift. It felt really good. And I have this sitting from the spring, but I probably could harvest a little bit.
Yeah.
There's only a little bit in there.
You need a lot more. You need. It looks like there's a teaspoon in there, right?
Yeah, there's probably a teaspoon in there. Yeah, it would be fun to have a jar. That would be amazing. It is a lot of work to do. And so it's nice to have a sustainable company and someone, especially you're a naturopathic doctor, you understand the body. There's so much more that I could ask you, but I definitely going to invite you back on. What's the best way people can find you?
The best way is online, CanadianPinePollen.com.
Okay.
The easiest way to find us. We have our contact information. If you had any questions, you can just shoot us an email, info@CanadianPinePollen.com. And I've compiled all the existing research, clinical trials, and human trials, and all the traditional references for Chinese references that were on that. There's one new study that came out of US actually, where they looked at the tincture, its impact on raising testosterone in men, like low testosterone men. That's not included in the research area there, but it's a lot of resources there. Over the years, we've made videos answering some of the questions, commonly asked questions that patients have or clients had. So it's all there, CanadianPinePollen.com. And
okay. Make this really short because I know I've taken a lot of your time.
It's all good. It's all good. I'm enjoying this.
Okay, great. Is the pine pollen tincture, it will increase testosterone in men. When I was actually drinking caffeine in my 30s, I had PCOS and I had high testosterone. And I think it was because my cortisol levels were probably really high because of the coffee. I can't handle it. For women that have had PCOS or have PCOS, is pine pollen going to increase their testosterone levels?
Right. So there's two scenarios clinical scenarios where you would ask this question. One would be PCOS. Another one would be prostate cancer, right? Because both of them are processes that are driven by testosterone. And the answer for both scenarios, whether it's PCOS, whether it's prostate cancer, is the outcome will be positive. And the reason the outcome will be positive, or it has a positive effect on PCOS or prostate cancer, is because the testosterone form that is in the pollen is not, it's a phytotestosterone, right? So the impact that you get from the molecules, the testosterone being the tip of the iceberg and the brassinosteroids being everything else underneath, is a balancing impact on testosterone. So the reason it raises testosterone in men is because most of the men in the studies are low testosterone, so it brings it up. But if you have testosterone, it has that allosteric, that balancing effect on the testosterone. So for PCOS, it can be used. For prostate cancer, it can be used. In fact, there's a lot of studies with prostate cancer cell lines and animal models of prostate cancer showing that there's improvement. There hasn't been so much study in PCOS because, unfortunately, it's a complicated, multifaceted disorder. It's not even a disease. There's not a lot of money for research for it. It hasn't been studied in that area, but I've used it clinically myself, and understanding that it's a phytoandrogen rather than an androgen itself. It's not a topical androgen gel or an oral androgen. It's a plant-based. It would be the same thing as asking, like, to just contrast this question, if phytoestrogens would be good for someone who has got high estrogens. They're going to have a balancing effect because they're going to bind to the receptor sites and keeping that estrogen having that negative effect. So same thing here is these phytoandrogens are going to bind to the receptor sites in PCOS and downregulate the negative effect of the elevated testosterone.
Great answer. Great explanation. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to talk with you, and I learned so much, and I know you did listening. Definitely go to the show notes and click on the links and buy some pine pollen from Canadian Pine Pollen Company. I know I am. Thank you, Dr. Saeid. And I hope you come back.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your energy, April, and thanks for having me here as your guest. And it's lovely to see that your passion and that you love what you're doing. It's good to be in that space.
Likewise. Very inspiring. I know you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Make sure to share with a friend. So we're all harvesting pine pollen in the spring. We do not want to miss the window. Also, I would love it if you gave our show a rating because it will help this podcast grow and it will help us continue bringing on amazing guests. All right, stay wild, stay human, and make sure you connect with the wild plants outside your door. I'm sending you so much love right now. Many blessings.